Here's a picture, a very simple picture, but your next line is, well, why should I subscribe to the New World Review? And quite simply, it's to attain regular JoJo content uploaded straight into your YouTube feed. Hello and welcome to the New World Review, your source for everything anime and manga. And today, JoJo things are happening, and as such, we are going to be delving into a discussion surrounding part 2 being battle tendency, and more accurately, the great divide of love and hate for this part of the story within the fan base. And I feel like I need to do this because yes, JoJo is a divisive series in general, but what I've noticed from the hundreds upon hundreds of comments that I've read from you guys is that opinions on part 2 are radically different. And at least from my anecdotal experience, it's pretty much split right down the middle. And I get that this might shock people who believe that part 2 is pretty much universally adored, but the reality is that is far from the case. And also to clear up where I stand right at the beginning, I love part 2. I think it's a nice tight piece of storytelling, and in my JoJo part rankings video, I put it at number 3. However, I did also ask you wonderful people to articulate for me why you do or do not enjoy battle tendency, and as a result, I do think I understand the situation for those of you who are not keen on it, and I'm going to present the arguments for and against it here today. To open this discussion though, I will restate my overall opinion, which is that part 2 was an exceptional evolution of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which took some framework laid out in part 1 and developed it into a short and sweet story with a far greater cast of characters, as well as significantly improved action and comedy. But I am also very willing to acknowledge that my overwhelmingly positive impression of battle tendency may have to do with where in the series it is placed, because I do have very fundamental issues with parts 1 and 3. But there are plenty of criticisms to be had, and we're going to start with the most common one that I found, which is that the characters of battle tendency simply aren't all that great. The one general exception to that statement seems to be Joseph, who by and large people seem to agree takes a very strong command of the series. Not everyone, but most. However, the real problems come within two main areas, one of which being the villains, and the other being the side characters in general. Now to explore the first, I do find the Pillar Men as a group to be far more effective of an antagonistic presence compared to part 1 Dio, but I will say that a lot of the heavy lifting here is placed squarely onto the shoulders of Wamu, who is by far the best explored villain in part 2, to the point where he becomes quite likable and even humanized, unlike the rest of the Pillar Men, specifically Kaz. And here is where I 100% agree with the criticism of battle tendency, because I found Kaz to be the weakest aspect of the entire series, and quite possibly one of the weakest aspects of JoJo in general. And to put it simply, he was just kind of boring. An evil brah who does evil things for the evils. Yay, that's fun. I mean, yes, he did have this like sliver of personality in that he displayed general care for the world around him, whether it be dogs or flowers, and it does seem to be specifically humanity that Kaz took issue with, which actually had the potential to be an interesting exploration, but all we ever really received from Kaz were breadcrumbs of a character that didn't fully form into a delicious antagonistic loaf. And that is a real shame, because if Kaz had a more profound presence, then I don't think there would be so much of an argument surrounding part 2, but this is an incredible detriment. I find it much more forgivable though due to the length of part 2. It's a story that you can really zip through and enjoy, and Kaz doesn't demand an incredible amount of time and energy to invest into, so you have the option of just, watching or reading about him and then forgetting him. It's not like the main antagonists of part 3 and onwards, where if you're not a huge fan of them, well, that's too bad, because you're going to be stuck with them for an awfully long time. Not that there are many of those, thankfully. But sticking to characters for now, another common ailment that appears to be expressed is dissatisfaction with the side characters, particularly that of Caesar. Now, he doesn't fall into a Kaz situation of just being a plain flat individual, but once again, due to the short nature of battle tendency, it is arguable that Caesar did not have the time necessary to experience a character arc that is worthy of his rather grand exit from the series. And of course, the moment where Joseph screams "Caesar" is, well, that's obviously a gigantic meme within the series in general, but this is also narratively intended to be the largest moment of emotional resonance within battle tendency that goes on to solidify Joseph's resolve to defeat the Pillar Men, and it just doesn't seem to have that impact for many people, because the journey from introducing Caesar as a rival, then forming a friendship and finally passing away can be seen as very rushed. And I can certainly see that perspective, although I don't necessarily agree with it myself. I personally think that Caesar's presence in battle tendency had a phenomenal effect, and when he died, I felt like I'd lost a character. And in my opinion, that's exactly how it should have felt. At the same time, it's very difficult for me to argue that that's how everyone should have seen this event, because the groundwork that was laid was the absolute bare minimum. So I can't blame anyone for just wanting that little bit more. And one more character that often gets a mention is Lisa, and here I'm going to agree with part 2 criticisms yet again, because I was actually really frustrated at how underutilized she was. Here stands probably the greatest Hamon master we have had access to, and she does a grand total of practically nothing, and the sigh I let out when she was dispatched so easily by cars was, well, one of the most extreme disappointment possible, because all I wanted from Lisa was for her to have a decent action sequence, which we never really got. And in regards to her overall as a mentor, not a whole lot was done there either, and actually she's probably far less developed of a mentor than Baron Zeppeli in part 1. So I think that Lisa is a very awkward character who is saved by her relation to Joseph and the eventual backstory we get regarding George. That was definitely my favorite Lisa moment. Is all of this a deal breaker for me? Not at all, but it is frustrating, and I very much empathize with those who do not like it. And I'd also like to counter the character grievance by highlighting Stroheim, who I feel was perfectly utilized in the role that he was given. Stroheim very much adds a much needed layer of texture to battle tendency by representing a third faction getting involved in the Hamon warriors versus stacked naked men conflict. In fact, without Stroheim, I think the battle tendency does risk the danger of being a rather flat story, but his presence only enhances part 2. And it goes to show that not every side character was a waste of potential. But getting into story now, and this is what I will most often praise battle tendency for, and it has a lot to do with the idea that this part is consistently moving and developing. It's not like the generally accepted format of JoJo, which started from part 3 onwards to be fair, but basically it was begin with an interesting premise, then spend 90% of the series fighting intellectually intriguing battles that don't really progress the story, and then a big climactic conclusion. So in retrospect, battle tendency really does stand out because it has no moments of what seem like forced obstacles that bring the story to a standstill. It all just flows very naturally, and that is something that I personally very much appreciate within the context of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as a whole. However, when you take the story of battle tendency and compare it to storytelling in general, just outside of the JoJo scope, then I don't know if it comes out looking so great anymore. Because when you get down to it, it is a fairly simple concoction. There is certainly nothing revolutionary about it or wildly hooking, but it is a story, which by default is going to propel that into the stratosphere of the JoJo part rankings because it has such little competition in that realm. Because I mean, what's going to give it a run for its money? Phantom Blood follows an evolving narrative, yes, but it's far more generic. And I think that the only solid argument you could make for a fantastic narrative all the way through would be Steel Ball Run or perhaps JoJo Leon. Golden Wind, maybe, but I would personally argue against it. It's just that everything from part 3 onwards does follow that aforementioned formula, where it feels like the large majority of the series is just roadblock after roadblock after roadblock that never really achieves anything narrative-wise. But that's not the case with battle tendency. Everything that happens is propelling the narrative forward. So battle tendency does kind of end up as the default winner in the minds of many through its competent dominance within this one narrative category. But the opposite is also very true, as battle tendency can be a default loser because many JoJo fans love that established format, the stand of the week business. And so because part 2 does not subscribe to that, it can very much be an automatic loser, which is entirely down to personal preference of storytelling. And while we're on that, the fact that it also does come from the pre-stand era can very much hurt part 2's perception because stands are obviously the lifeblood of JoJo, and part 2 doesn't have any of that life to it. And that's fair enough if you're reading or watching this series for fun and intriguing stands, in which case I can understand that battle tendency just is not going to be your jam. But I also want to examine this topic from a more meta perspective because a very fascinating point was brought up by a few of you, which is that it's not so much that battle tendency is considered to be a bad part, it's more that its impression has been harmed by perception within the fanbase. And one way of presenting this case is the idea of overhyping media. I mean, for example, I can say all I want that battle tendency is a brilliant part, but if you have not seen or read it, then after hearing my statement, your expectations will have been artificially raised. And then once you delve into the media yourself and you find that it is a simply generally enjoyable, competent story, then despite all of that, you may feel a bit disappointed because my statement promised you so much more than what part 2 was capable of delivering. So over the years, if there has been grand support for part 2 to the point where it has built up a solid status within the JoJo community, then there is quite naturally going to be an anti-part 2 faction that develops, full of people who were promised something amazing and now have a skewed perception of battle tendency because it did not live up to artificially inflated expectations. And for those people who already believe that battle tendency is overhyped, then they are going to be subject to their own confirmation bias, generally seeking out and accepting opinions that support their initial view rather than challenging their thinking, which over time only further degrades their opinion on the matter. And by the way, that works in the opposite direction as well, with part 2 superfans dismissing concerns of those who aren't so keen on it and only accepting opinions that agree with their own thoughts. And that is a recipe for the extreme divide in the opinion that I have observed. People seem to either rank part 2 incredibly high or next to, if not smack bang in last place. There doesn't seem to be a lot of room for nuance here. And to take this even a step further, this can also end up affecting the impression of battle tendency tendency without even taking the series itself into account. And this can occur when big fans of part 2 become hypercritical of other parts due to everything they lack the battle tendency claims as a strength, like consistent story for example. Now what results from this is a very annoying human phenomena where because you may have had a bad encounter and dislike a particular individual, then you also come to dislike the things that that person lacks. Let's say your personal favorite part is attacked by a battle tendency lover, then your natural reaction might be rather sadly to bring a sense of dislike onto part 2 because of that individual. And you see this an awful lot in politics, and it's an especially unproductive view, but it does exist, so bleh. And the final point I'd like to address is that I also saw a lot of comments stating a dislike towards battle tendency because it doesn't fit in with the original JoJo trilogy. And I guess that's primarily because it doesn't focus on dealing with Dio. So it can be a bit disconnected in that way, but it is one point that I wholeheartedly disagree with. If anything, the part that feels out of place in the original trilogy is Stardust Crusaders, because it takes what JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was and turns it into an almost completely unrecognizable product with an entirely new power system and narrative structure. Whereas I find that part 1 and part 2 go together pretty fantastically, with the Pillar Men being a natural escalation of the Stone Mask mystery, an expansion of Hamon, and a cast of characters that tie incredibly closely to that of the part 1 crew. And I actually wish that Stardust Crusaders had been able to escalate this further, because in my opinion just bringing back Dio doesn't quite cut it. And it still feels like its own adventure, which I guess is also fine. I just think that saying that part 2 is the odd one out is a very strange statement, but once again, to each their own. As for me though, I've come out of this discussion with a new appreciation for the flaws of battle tendency, and I completely understand those who rate this part exceptionally low. The story is admittedly pretty standard. Many of the characters are quite underutilized, and the part suffering from overhype is only going to exacerbate those issues. I still think for what it is though, battle tendency comes close to maximizing what it wants to be in the time allotted to it. And once again, the fact that this part is so short makes many, if not all of the very real issues much more forgivable than issues in later parts, because they are far more enduring tales. And as a result, said issues can become quite the test of endurance. But what do you guys think? Please do feel free to share your thoughts on battle tendency in the comments below, or even join my Discord server. And if you're keen for some more JoJo content, then please do go and check out some of my other videos, or even subscribe to the channel for regular JoJo wonder delivered straight into your YouTube feed. But for now, this has been the New World Review, and I'll see you next time.